Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here again for another conversation on Chinese philosophy in our virtual symposium. So after mainly talking about Confucianism and traditional Chinese philosophy or Taiwanese philosophy in the last meetings, today we are approaching Buddhism. I would say finally, because it was time also to look at another important part of the Chinese intellectual history and tradition. And our speaker today will be Dr. Laura Lettere, but I would like to ask Professor Chiara Ghidini to introduce our speaker today in more detail and tell us something more about Dr. Lettere's talk. Then, as you know, there will be a Q&A session afterwards, during which you can participate, ask your questions either in the chat or directly raising your hand. And so I hope you will enjoy our event today. So please, Chiara.
Thank you, Federico. Welcome to everybody. So today, Dr. Laura Lettere will talk about philosophy through narrative, the life of the Buddha. Laura is now a postdoc fellow with the Roberto Foundation program in Buddhist Studies here at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. And well, most of her work now focuses on the Buddha Charita, and the Buddha Charita she's been working on for quite a long time now is also the topic of her PhD dissertation. She finished her PhD 2 years ago with a joint program with the University La Sapienza in Rome and the University of Ghent, the Center for Buddhist Studies. She has also published in Italian, English, and Chinese, not only on Buddha Charita. Usually, Laura's approach is a combination of philological and Buddhist studies, but this time, actually, she is exploring a new approach, and so we are very eager to listen to what she has to say, and I think it's going to be quite stimulating. So we also wait for your questions after her talk. So I leave the floor to Laura, and please.
Okay,
Laura.
so good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chiara, Lisa, and Federico for organizing this workshop. So yes, today, let me share my screen. So today I'm gonna talk about how philosophy is presented in the Buddha Charita. So philosophy through narrative in particular, which is about, of course, the life of the Buddha. So can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, all is good.
Okay. Just a quick question. Just tell me if the screen freezes. Sometimes it happens with Teams. So, well, anyway, let's get started. So first of all, I will very briefly introduce the geography of the Buddha, what kind of materials we usually deal with when we talk about the life of the Buddha. Then I'll explain a little bit why the Buddha Charita, which is a narrative, actually is a poem, narrative poem, is so important in vehiculating philosophy. Then we'll skip to the description of a philosophical system in the Buddha Charita. I promise I will deal with these points quite quickly, because I want to focus on the problem of the creation of the world as presented in the Buddha Charita. And also because today actually we can assess to this, we can deal with this problem just through the Chinese and Tibetan translation of the poem. And so it, of course, there's also a typo here. So the problem of the creation of the world was introduced through the Buddha Charita in China by means of the Chinese translation text from the 5th century. So I will raise some conclusions on the philosophical system and on the refutation of this idea of the creation of the world as presented on the Buddha Charita, and I'll let you with some open question. Actually, This work is sort of like in progress now, but I'm very happy to present it to some fellow sinologists, so we can actually maybe discuss how this idea of the creation of the world was possibly received in medieval China, and what kind of developing this kind of argumentation could have had. So, as I said, a geography, and I will be fast on this. So, usually when dealing with the geography of the Buddha, we deal with different kind of sources. They're so-called old sources, but nobody actually presents them as so old nowadays. Well, these are the information about the life of the Buddha we can derive from the Sutta Pitaka and from the Vinaya in Pali. So Vinaya is the monastic rule, monastic regulations. Actually, these sources are considered the oldest. So many scholars, especially in the past, thought that reading this kind of narrative, we could actually understand something on what happened to the historical Buddha. So they thought we can derive actually historical details from this kind of material. But it's also very problematic because most of this material is actually available in the Chinese translation, especially the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, for example. So these monastic rules are mostly available today in Chinese translations that were made in the 3rd century. Then there is the so-called later hagiographic material, or what I personally call the Vastu literature. Which, these are works in Sanskrit, not in Pali. And we also mainly focus on 2 works, which are the Mahavastu from the Lokottaranavadins Vinaya, and the Sanghabheda Vastu, which is from the Mulasarvastivadin Vinaya. Then there are some literary biographies, like the Buddha Charita, the Lalita Vistar in Sanskrit, and also later works, but in Sanskrit and Pali. Actually, while this material mostly covers the life of the Buddha after the Enlightenment, with some just a few information on the youth, on the birth, on the youth, and then on the ascetic practices of the Buddha. This kind of narrative starts from the very birth of the Buddha, giving a lot of details about his youth. And then we have Jataka Tales. These are tales of the previous lives of the Buddha, or sometimes are just tales that are meant to have some moral aim. Sometimes this moral aim is even is not even that clear, but they're in collection both in Pali, Sanskrit, and many other Central Asian languages, and in Chinese. So most of the material shouldn't be considered as chronologically ordered, or like also the division by genre is not even that clear because it's some sort of fluctuating materials. Jataka Tales have influenced the accounts in the monastic codes and also the literary biographies. So it's some sort of fluctuating materials, and it's very difficult to deal with this kind of text philologically because most of like the exchange on this kind of tales, on narratives, actually happened in the oral tradition. So why the Buddha Charita is so important, and how does this poem deal with philosophy actually? So first of all, the Buddha Charita is a Mahakavya, so it's an ornate poem, it's a literary work, and one of the earliest and the finest examples in the Sanskrit tradition. It's actually a beautiful poem. It was composed very early, probably around the 1st and 2nd century CE by the poet Ashvaghosha, who will become some sort of bodhisattva in China. There's amazing study by Professor Stuart Young on this topic. And also another definition for the Buddha Charita is that of a sarga bandha. So it's a collection of chapters or a sarga linked together in a story. And we have 14 chapters in the Sanskrit, with the beginning and the end also lost. So the beginning of the 1st chapter and the last part of the 14th. We can read a longer account of the life of the Buddha, a longer version of the Buddha Charita, both in the Chinese translation of Huoso Xinzan. It's a poem from the 5th century, translated much probably or almost surely by Bao Yun, this incredibly active translator, and some of you may have heard about him already. And the Chinese translation is in 28 chapters. There's also a Tibetan translation, also in 28 chapters. It was completed in the 13th century. The title is Sangye Ki Chopa She Chawe Nyannan Tempo. And thanks to the Tibetan teachers all'Orientale for teaching me how to read. And any mistakes is, of course, my responsibility, not theirs. So, why I put this date here, 1837, is the year in which the first manuscript of the Buddha Charita reached Europe. It was like a copied version by some Nepali scholar called Amritananda. He made a copy in Devanagari and it was sent to Paris. So, of course, the first scholars to notice the Buddha Charita were French. And Eugène Bournouf was the first to deal with it, and it actually thought that the Buddha Charita wasn't that useful. I mean, it said, oh, well, it's in Sanskrit, it's not that long, it skips so many details on the life of the Buddha, so probably we cannot use it to understand the historical context in which the Buddha lived. And Bournouf's impression actually lasted very long in the French tradition. Sylvain Lévy wrote, published an interesting study on the Buddha Charita some years later, but then he never engaged in a critical edition of the text. And also André Barrault, which is the most important scholar on the eldest sources on the life of the Buddha, didn't deal with the Buddha Charita at all. So the first critical edition was made by Edward Cowell. We also have a very early Italian translation by Carlo Formichi with a very beautiful introduction, but this work has largely been forgotten, probably because Formichi had very embarrassing political commitments in those years. And then we have the monumental work by Edward Hamilton Johnston, who actually did a new critical edition by comparing the text with the Chinese and the Tibetan and translating with a standard translation. Philosophy in the Buddha Charita. I will divide the presentation of philosophy in the Buddha Charita in two levels. One level is implicit, the other level is descriptive. Implicit level, it's the way in which the Buddha Charita presents a conflict between the Buddhist tradition and the Brahmanical tradition. This conflict probably wasn't even there when the Buddha was alive, but it was there in the first century, second century, when the Buddha Charita was actually composed. So actually, even if we cannot actually derive historical information on the life of the Buddha through reading the Buddha Charita, we can derive a lot of philosophical and historical context in which the poem was composed. So there is a very interesting study of 2006 by Alf Hiltbeitel about how the Buddha Charita is in a dialogue with the epics, and another very, very important study by Patrick Olivelle about how the Buddha Charita is engaging in redefining the term Dharma. Dharma as a moral law and as the core of the doctrine of the Buddha. And Patrick Olivelle defines 6 different dharmas and shows that how in the Buddha Charita we gradually shift from a Brahmanical definition of dharma, a dharma that regulates the lives and the social environment in the Brahmanical tradition, to the Buddhist dharma. So these are 2 very interesting studies, and I think it took like more than a century of rereading, decades after decades, the poem to reach to this level. Another important consideration is how the role of kinship is defined in the Buddha Charita. There's a lot of king and dialogue with kings, and the father of the Buddha, Shuddhodana, is also presented as a king in the Buddha Charita. Actually, I also wrote something soloist for this self-advertisement about kinship in the Buddha Charita, but I didn't dare put my name beside all these very important scholars, so I just put this sign to remind me to tell you this. So according to me, the idea of kinship in the Buddha Charita starts from a Brahmanical perspective, or also we can say from the Pali definition of the Rajadharma, and then we go to the complete refutation of the of kinship by the Buddha, and then if we can, if we take the Chinese translation of the poem as reliable, in the end we see that the poem transforms kingship and redefines it in a Mahayana perspective. So there is like some sort of bodhisattva king presented in the end and identified with Ashoka. So this is for the implicit level in which the Buddha of philosophy in the Buddha Charita, and then I will talk about the descriptive level. There are actually depictions, more than one, of philosophical debate in the Buddha Charita. And of course, most of the scholars focused on the role of early Sankhya in the Buddha Charita. So I'm posing here the first article on this topic with Stephen A. Kent that summarized the problem, but also it's very important to read the Malcolm Eckel recent study, and that also present a bibliography on this point. So early Sankhya is doctrinal system, early doctrinal system in India. Sankhya means numbers, and it presents some metaphysics in 25 different elements interacting, and we'll talk about it later. But most of the scholars focused on this point because there is an exchange between a Sankhya or early Sankhya representative, which is Arada Kalama, and the Buddha. And of course, the Buddha refutes and contradicts Arada Kalama. And most of the studies are on how this early Sankhya is presented in the Buddha Charita, and how it developed in the classical system some centuries afterwards. Well, today I am going to focus on this aspect, so how other early systems, doctrinal, philosophical systems are dealt with in the Buddha Charita. And it's very interesting because most of them are only presented in the Chinese translation. We have, and the Tibetan one, of course, but we will focus on the Chinese. We have lost the Sanskrit, probably, and so the only way we can assess these kind of materials is from the Chinese translation. And for reference, I'm using Patrick Olivel translation from the Sanskrit and Charles Willeman translation, English translation from the Chinese. So let's get started with the presentation of and description of philosophical system in the Buddha Charita. So the first presentation, the first introduction to these philosophical systems is in chapter 9. We see that the prince, Sarvartasiddha, how is it called in the Buddha Charita, has left his father's palace during the night. He actually flew away, and he wants to practice like an ascetic. He was to reach some sort of superior truth. He wants to get freedom from sufferance. And of course, his father, all his relatives are actually desperate about his decision. So his father, first of all, sent some emissaries, some embassy to him. And he sends his prime minister, his mantrin, and his chaplain, the Purohita, to talk with the prince with the aim of convincing him to go back to his father's palace. So it's interesting that the Purohita presents different philosophical systems to the Buddha, as in contradiction between each other. Practically, the chaplain of the king says, okay, I understand that you don't want to be the next king because you have this idea or searching for the Dharma, to practice austerities, to become, to realize what's after our life, to get release. But you see, all these philosophical systems, they all support different and conflicting ideas. How can we be sure that there is an afterlife? How can we actually be sure that which one is right? Some of them support that there is a prakriti or like primeval nature informing the world. Some of them say that there is svabhava, is the metaphysics of the universe, or about this svabhava-vadin and this early philosophical system. There is an article that I wrote here. It's very debated. There's no actual conclusion about what svabhava is. Then the Purohita say, someone thinks that it is the god Ishvara, Zitsaitian in Chinese, that created the world. And then someone says that there is an Atman, it's the self. Someone even says there's no afterlife. There's some so-called Nastika. They say that there's no afterlife. So in this kind of confusion and conflicting ideas, how can you renounce to your life royal position just to practice austerities? And the Buddha replies, let me read this, ihasti nahastiti aesha samshaya parasya vakyairna mamatra nishaya avetya tattvam tapasashamena cha svayam agrahishyami yadatra nishitam. So as to the doubt whether a birth exists or not, my judgment will not be based on another's words. Perceiving the truth by calm and ascetic toil, I shall myself render judgment on this point. So the Buddha sort of make a promise, like, I want to understand what's behind reality, what's the nature of reality through ascetic toil, through meditation, to practicing austerities. So he rejects he rejects all these philosophical views. Well, it's not that he's rejecting, but it's like, I want to decide myself. I want to understand what's behind the reality myself. So this is chapter 9 of the Buddha Charita. Chapter 12 is the famous meeting with Jataka Lama, the representative of Sanskrit tradition. It is shaped like a dialogue. I will be fast on it. So Jataka Lama actually never said I'm from the Samkhya tradition, but he mentioned Kapila, the sage Kapila, as later will be identified with the founder of classical Arya systems. And he presents this system of 25 principles. In 24 of them are the so-called kshetra, in which prakriti is the primeval nature and vikara is transformation. And then there is knower of the field of kshetra jna that is separated from the kshetra, and release actually happens when the kshetra jna or knower of the field realize that he is separated from the field. This is a dialogue, of course, and in this dialogue, Jataka Lama first explains his system, and then he also explains a system of progressive meditation and trance stages in order to reach release. And the main refutation of the Buddha is that if you think that kshetra jna is a permanent self that can get release by actually acknowledging of being separated from the field, you're not abandoning your notion of ego, and you're maintaining that there is a soul. So you're not liberated, you're still attached to the idea of a soul. And so we can see that even before the Enlightenment, the Buddha is already refuting the idea that Prakriti, the main metaphysics of the Samkhya system, the Buddha is refuting Prakriti as the possible nature of reality. But we still have to deal with Svabhava, Zixin, the god Ishvara, Zitsaitian, Atman, which is Wo, Nastika. I didn't put the Chinese translation because It was translated as a periphrasis, like those who say that there is no reality. So when the Buddha said that he wants to understand it himself, he made a sort of promise, and he achieves this realization in the 14th chapter. So I put this glittery line here to tell you that this chapter is half in Sanskrit. We lost the second half and we only have Chinese and Tibetan translation. So in the 14th chapter, we have the Buddha awakening. So he realized that what is samsara, all the cycle of rebirths. He sees all the evil rebirths, the good rebirths in heaven. So he has a whole image of the universe, of his previous lives. And then there's this passage, 有观身合应 见从诸有业 见眼观有业 非自在天生 非自在非我 亦复非无因 He further observed, what is the cause of creation is so that all complete with karma of existence. So all is regulated by karmic retribution. His divine eye observed that the karma of existence was not produced by the god Ishvara, nor by a specific nature or by a self, and neither was it without a cause. So this is Nastika, a reference to the Nastika. Philologically speaking, I note that this fei part is actually repeated in the canon in a work that I really loved, which is the Surleka by Nagarjuna, Letter to a Friend. In Chinese, it becomes an admonition to kings. This text, as I know, is only in Tibetan and probably in two Chinese translations. Actually, very recently, and when I say very recently, I intend like half an hour ago before starting this presentation, I saw that the Surleka also probably have a Sanskrit. I saw a Sanskrit text, but probably it is reconstructed from Tibetan. So this translation is attributed to Samgavarman. And there is a sentence, both here in the translation of the Buddha Charita and in the Surleka. And guess who was the main collaborator and interpreter of Sangavarma? It was Bao Yun, same author. Well, anyway, so this sentence is also repeated in other three texts. One is attributed to Sangavarman. I don't know what is the corresponding Sanskrit. I have to do some research about it. And these two texts were probably all, one of them deal with Ayuan, so something connected to King Ashoka, or some sort of Ashokavadana, but they probably composed in China. So, the problem of the creation of the world in the Buddha Charita, and I'm going to the core of the presentation. So we see that presentation of this philosophical system, Prakriti was refuted within the meaning of Arada. All the other philosophical systems are refuted somehow during the awakening of the Buddha. In that very moment, the Buddha understood that this kind of philosophical systems are not consistent. And then there is a full explanation of why these philosophical systems are inconsistent and are wrong. These philosophical views are wrong. And this is happening in the 18th chapter that we only have in Chinese and Tibetan. And the chapter we deal with the conversion of Anathapindada. Anathapindada is a very rich person. Actually, in the end, will buy an ashram, an abode for the Buddha, and will paint it with golden tiles, covering it with golden tiles as a price. Anyway, it's interesting that in the second part of the Buddha Charita, the one that we only have in Chinese and Tibetan, there's no dialogue, actually. It's the Buddha talking most of the time. So Anathapindada approaches the Buddha, kneels in front of the Buddha. It doesn't even have the time to say anything. The Buddha just say, okay, I see you are a very intelligent person. So you probably will understand why the god Ishvara is not the creator of the world, why behind the world is no Svabhava, why the Atman is not the creator of the world, and let me add some notion also on time and the attributes. So this is what we can gather from the Chinese translation. So 若自在见身，五脏又现后，以物物道轮，生之不应灭. So if the world were produced by Ishvara, there will be no old or young, first or last. There will be no will of the five destination. The born will not be extinguished, of course, because if it's the perfect, superior entity that created the world, of course, it will produce everything at the same time. So this is an argument that they call simultaneity. And there will be no calamities, doing evil will not be wrong, pure or impure actions will come from the god Ishvara. So this is some sort of theodicy in the sense that if Ishvara created the world, everything will be perfect, there will be no evil thing. This is a very common, actually, refutation of the existence of God, the problem of evil. So, 若自在天生，实际不应疑，如自从复生，所不舍其存. If the world were produced by the god Ishvara, he will not be doubt, just as the son is produced by the father. We will not be conscious of his honored one. So this is the problem of homogeneity. We will be like Ishvara and nobody will doubt him. It's funny that they use this metaphor, like just as the son is produced by the father, which is something which I actually often doubt. Anyway, when one met with suffering, one will not, on the other hand, resent God. All will honor Ishvara and will serve no other spirit. So the worship of Ishvara should be unanimous. And in fact, we can observe that there is a plurality of gods, many gods and many different views on this point. Then if Ishvara were the maker, it will not be called sovereign. Sovereign, this translation, I remember that this translation is by Charles Willeman here. Sovereign because in Chinese is zicai, one is that is consistent on itself. But as the maker, he will constantly have to produce. If he were constantly producing, he would himself toil. Why then call him sovereign? So practically here, the refutation of the Buddha is posing the characteristic of Ishvara, of the god Ishvara for production as a limiting condition. So it's not a supreme god. They actually have to produce constantly. So how we can say that he's the supreme God is if he's conditioned. Then there is another condition, that's will. He will either produce unwittingly as the action of an infant or produce intentionally. If he had the intention to produce, he will not be sovereign. So if he produced without actually wanting to produce, then he will be like an infant. And this is very typical, not only in Indian tradition where Bala, infant, means like a fool, but also in our classical tradition in Roman, Greek culture. Actually, there's no positive view. It's rare to have a positive view or infant or, so to say, so childhood. So anyway, it says that if he wants to produce, then he has a will to produce. It also is something like limiting him. He's not the supreme entity. Then if suffering or happiness come from beings, then these are not made by Ishvara. So there is a problem here. If suffering and happiness are actually belonging to creators, then Ishvara is not the supreme creator because there is something which is not created by him. If Ishvara produced suffering or happiness, he would have love or hate. Because he would have love or hate, he should not be called sovereign. So of course, there's no supreme being which is like conditioned. Again, is an argument from theodicy, from having feelings. If furthermore sovereign were active, beings will be quiet, confiding in sovereign power. What will be the use of practicing good? One just might practice good or evil, but will not have the retribution of the action. This is what I call an argument from amorality instead of an argument from morality. So if we, in the Buddha perspective, so if we are afraid of some sort of bad retribution, we tend to behave according to some sort of moral standards. But if everything depends from a supreme God, what's the use of doing good things instead of bad things? In the end, it's like the God that creates and destroys everything. So our actions are not influenced in this perspective. Then, if sovereignty were produced by actions, all will be actions in common with human beings. If they were action in common, all will be called sovereigns. This is an argument that is clearly exposed in a text I'm going to briefly talk you about in a few minutes. If actually the characteristic of Ishvara is that he creates things, then actually all human beings are skillfully able to create something. So actually, if we are like Ishvara as is creation, then we all like some sort of Ishvara. And then the last two arguments, if Ishvara were uncause, all would be non-existent too. Of course, if there is no cause of Ishvara, all the world is uncaused. If he would rely on another sovereign, then the number of sovereigns would be without end. That is why beings all have no maker. We have the problem of the external cause. So if Ishvara is caused by something else, then it's not supreme. And then we have the problem of a regressus in infinitum. If there is an external cause of Ishvara, then we have a cause of the cause of the cause, and etc. So in this case, this expression is usually positive in Chinese, like the heart and the skies are boundless, but here is usually in a negative sense of a regressus in infinitum. So, in the end, we have a QED. Know that the meaningfulness of a sovereign name is destroyed in discussion. All meanings are mutually contradicted. If there is no explanation, there is an error, and this is QED. So, and then it goes on with the refutation of Svabhava or Atman, but actually we don't have time to deal with all of that, and I'm sort of like approaching the conclusion here. But first of all, I want to say that this is probably one of the earliest refutation of Ishvara in the Chinese canon. The only other example is in a text attributed, guess to whom? Nagarjuna, again. So we have Nagarjuna here in the Suruleka, there is a parallel verse, and here. This is a translation by Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva didn't actually translate the text philologically. Nobody did, but in particular Kumarajiva did compendiums, some sort of like summarized and reshaped the text a lot. This Sharman Lu and this Dvadasha Nikaya Shastra is never mentioned in the Buddhist tradition in India, so we don't know if this text is actually a work by Nagarjuna. But we see that there is an almost identical process of refutation of Ishvara in the Chinese Buddha Charita and in these 12 gates, Dvadasha Nikaya Shastra. Also, there are two similar metaphors. The one is in the argumentation for homogeneity, when he says that like the son is produced by a father in this undoubt. We find this metaphor in both the text. And then also will as a limiting condition with parallel with an infant or a child playing. Use Ru Xiao R C, here Ru Yin R. It's present in both the texts. Both the texts also have a refutation of Svabhava. But only the Buddha Charita has also a refutation of time and Atman as creators. So, conclusions. No, actually, before conclusion, two curiosities, and then I'll leave you with conclusions. I usually put a methodological line, not like the glittery line I showed you before, but it's like some sort of limit that I put to my research to the 6th century, beginning of the 6th century, because afterwards, like it becomes too big to research texts from such a wide time span. But out of curiosity, what happened to to Ishvara, to this Zizaitian in the Matangi Sutra? Matangi Sutra is some sort of Pan-Asian bestseller. It's found in many languages. It's a treatise on astronomy, astrology, cosmogony. So we can see here, 这在天之造于世界，头以为天，组成为地。So actually what this says is like the Lord Ishvara created the world, his head became the sky, his foot became the heart, his eyes became the sun and the moon, etc. And his waist became the space, his hair became vegetation, plants. So you can see Ishvara has become something like the Indian Purusha or the Indian Pangu in this Matangi Sutra. A text is actually in the canon is like attributed to the Han Dynasty, but it's probably not so old because it contains some notion on astronomy that are not found before the 6th century. And also, like out of curiosity, although I know this is not Ishvara, of course, but it is Maheshvara, but it was such a nice painting. I also thank my colleague Serena Otiero for suggesting that it is from the Siddhanta tradition. This is the depiction of Maheshvara from the Mogao caves. It's in cave 360 on the southern wall, so probably on the left when you enter. I took it from an article by Zhang Yuanlin. So conclusion, finally. So what can we conclude? There is some sort of close relationship between the Buddha Charitas, we can read it in Chinese, and texts attributed to Nagarjuna, and not Yogacara. Anyway, there's some sort of refutation of Ishvara in the Yogacara tradition as well, but it's not as articulated and elegant as the one we can find in the Buddha Charita and in this text attributed to Nagarjuna. By the way, sorry, I forgot to tell you that this second text attributed to Nagarjuna is considered one of the 3 most important texts in the Madhyamika tradition in East Asia. I'm not saying that Ashvaghosha, the author of the Buddha Charita, was a Madhyamika. I'm probably suggesting that he didn't actually care so much and he just took material from different sources. I want to underline that there is more than one philosophical opponent in the Buddha Charita. All the actual debate is focused on the Arada Kalama kind of Sankhya, but actually we have a lot of minor systems, this Vabhavika, the supporters of the god Ishvara, probably Proto-Nyaya, Atmanvadi, no, Nastika, and there is a lot of attention also given to this doctrinal philosophical system, and we can read it in the Chinese or Tibetan translation. Going to China. I hope you don't find me too simplistic, but actually I was asking to myself, and I didn't answer that. What I say, it's a open question. What kind of effect this kind of refutation of a supreme god could have had in China? The first thing that came to my mind was Confucius. So in the famous, very famous Anacletus, he says, Jilu asked, sorry, I am quoting James Ledger translation. It's probably not the reference translation, but actually I found it yesterday, this quote came to my mind. Jilu asked about serving the spirits of the dead, or spirits and dead. The master says, while you are not able to serve men, how can you serve the spirits? Jilu adds, I ventured to ask about that. He was answered, while you do not know life, how can you know about death? This is Confucius, Lun Yu, it's a very famous quotation. The second thing that came to my mind, sorry for this dramatic shift, is the myth that China has no creation myth by Paul Goldin, Professor Goldin. It was a very interesting review of various cosmogonic mythology, so about the creation of the world in China. There's Tao, there's Arshen, Pangu, of course, Tai, Lao Jun, Tai Shu. But my question is, was there some sort of debate among this different view of the origin of the world? The only reference to some sort of debate is where that I found in this study from Professor Goldin is that the famous myth by Nuwa, it appears in a lost essay in a collection called Dissecting Delusions. Somehow the author of this collection, Yin Shao, supported that Nuwa was just some sort of superstition or sort of unreal account of the origin of humankind. This is the only reference to some sort of dialogue between these different cosmogonies that I found in China, but as I'm sure that there are many of you, many sinologists present to this conversation will help me to solve this problem by suggesting some interesting debates maybe, or where to look for them at least. So thank you everybody for your patience and your attention, and here we are.
Thank you, Laura. This is actually very interesting, and I'm sure that a lot of people will like to ask questions. Well, it appears quite clear now that one of Laura's focuses, Laura, maybe if I silence you, that we have less buffering, just provisional silencing, not absolute silencing. So one of the main focuses of Laura has always been translation. Ever since I actually met her, translation, yes, as of course a cultural practice, but all the problems or all the wonderful things that come out of translation. And yes, mostly, well, the focus is from Sanskrit into Chinese, but I guess that translation problems arise also when things are translated into English. As for Japan, I remember a lot of, let's say, medieval or more generally pre-modern Zen works that resent of Suzuki Daisetsu's rendition in English. So we have a lot of words like the absolute, the relative, and if you look at the Chinese, well, there is no such word. So I guess that also reasoning about translation is not secondary, even when we talk about philosophy. But I would like to leave the floor to people who want to ask questions, and I just think that the best way is to raise your virtual hand so that we can spot you and catch you. So Serena Saccone, a professor here of Indian religions and philosophies, is the first one. Serena.
Yes.
And then,
first of all, sorry for not showing my real face. So I have, first of all, thanks a lot, because it was extremely fascinating, truly fascinating, because I'm used to dealing with a lot of these arguments, but in later developments, in later elaborations, in later Buddhist works. And it's quite interesting to see such a early witness of arguments against non-Buddhist schools. So this is also extremely interesting. And all these arguments that you are quoting on, in a way or in another, re-elaborated, used, reused in later authors. So I've seen all of them in later elaborations. My question, I actually have a few questions. One would be if you can be more explicit, if you have actually the grasp of all of them, on the kind of topics of the debate. So the topics that are meaning Atman and so on and so forth, aside from Ishvara that you mentioned. So which are the other topics of the debate? And I'm interested in knowing if there is, according to you, any logical order or succession of their treatment, if you already have somehow understood if there is, for example, some sort of like a logic behind the succession of the arguments that are refuted or the topics of the debate. Sorry, maybe it's too many questions. So maybe you can first respond to this, and then I'll go on with the other questions.
Yes, as in the argumentation with Narada Kalama, okay, this problem of the logical order is a very well posed question, actually, and it's a very good question, because we are dealing with a poem. And so it's not meant to be a logical treatment of all these topics, but sometimes it's like there's a lot of repetition of the same arguments, probably because it was like built in a poetical way. We can just guess about it from the Chinese, and we have a witness of this kind of structure in the 12th chapter. And the argumentation about svabhava is again of the multiplicity of causes. There is an argumentation about immanence or location. So if svabhava is located in a place, where does it create? Outside of itself or in itself? There is this problem, so simultaneity again, homogeneity related to attributes, to permanence, in the impossibility of deliverance. There is an argument also on invisibility, because there's something connected also to the idea of avyakta somehow. And these arguments are also in the other text, the 12 gates, the Dvadasha Nikaya Shastra. I have to say that the Dvadasha Nikaya Shastra proposed them in a more coherent way, being a proper philosophical text. And also, it also treats in detail something connected to the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. So it's like more philosophical and logical in the approach. Actually, philologically speaking, I cannot say that these two texts in Chinese are related, but probably they were originally. Either they were based on the same argumentation, or they were like quoting each other. So there was a relation, but it's not evident from the Chinese text. So it didn't happen in China, according to me, to my. Then in the Buddha Charita, we also have the refutation of time as creator, by saying that if time was the creator, then it will be perfect, and then every moment should be identical to the each moment should be identical to the preceding one. So there wouldn't be change in time. So time will be perfect moment after moment, so to say. Then it says that the attributes of Dravya are not the cause, and the Atman is not the cause and is not the creator, because it cannot create at will, and because it creates evil, so it cannot be a perfect creator. And Atman as a creator is also in a contradiction with the skillful means. If Atman could create, it would just create perfect things. Why create a deficitary universe, so to say? So these are the arguments for svabhava and Atma in the Buddha Charita, in the translation of the Buddha Charita in Chinese. And I have to say that Pseudo Nagarjuna 12 gated is presented in a more organized philosophical kind of argumentation.
Yes, I think you sort of responded already to the other question. I wanted to know, because you are showing us, of course, the arguments that are in favor, or better said, against. So in favor of the Buddhist position, against, for example, Ishvara, let's say. But I was curious if there was anyhow some fictional debate, which is very common in the later philosophical treatises, which is also useful because you somehow like go deeper into your own view if you, for example, create fictional opponents. So
yes, well, they create Ashvagosha create a fictional opponent for Sankhya, Arada Kalama, okay, deriving this figure from the Pali canon. It was the first teacher of the Buddha.
Yes.
But all the others, they didn't have an opponent. Anathapindana is not an opponent. It just listened to this explanation. It's not a support of any of this. So it's that the Buddha
So this is he is at the beginning as an opponent, but then he responds to the objections sometimes.
No.
And
No. After the Buddha's preaching, he says, okay, you convince me, I buy you the Jetavana.
Okay.
So the second half of the Buddha Charita is very problematic.
I see. And then last but not least, do you have any ideas of possible identification of the other opponents aside from this early Samkhya?
There's a lot of debate about this Bhabhavavadin. A lot of people saying the scholar saying Bhabhava is materialism or not. But I didn't want to get deep into this topic because this pertains to philosophy of India, and then it was like very complicated. And Ishvara is probably some early Nyaya kind of thing, and then Atmavadin probably Upanishadic background. Sorry.
Okay, there is no internal debate with other Buddhist traditions or stuff of the sort.
Buddhist traditions, no.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Okay, and so while there is no debate, internal debate there is internal debate here. So I see another hand. It belongs to Federica Sandre, I believe, from the University of Leipzig, but I may be wrong. So to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes, sorry, I'm very unfamiliar with Teams. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And yes, I am from the University of Leipzig. An addition, basically, you find debates with the same arguments and the same structure of the arguments against Ishvara about 100 years or 200 years later at the early Tang dynasty between Buddhists and Taoists. And there they use they debate against
Wonderful.
the idea, because early Tang dynasty, you have a political situation where Taoism is very strong, and Taoism says we were the first because Tao created everything. And the Buddhists debate against that, and they come up with a lot of these arguments, like I've kind of traced them to the Changshelun too, but it's basically these Ishvara arguments, very similar arguments, and I think you might be able to find that in the apologetic literature where you have debates between Buddhists and Taoists, even earlier ones, that I can confirm.
You're not only making my day, you're making my semester. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you
That
so
is
much.
the Qi Gujin Fo Dao Lun Heng, the Chinese text where you find that records these debates. That's Dao Xuan.
Okay.
T2104. The last two chapters, but even before possibly.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's exactly the kind of thing I was looking for.
I've been looking I'm happy somebody works on that on the Buddhist side, because it is a very fascinating argument. So I was very thrilled by your talk too.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Turn this off again.
Yes, thank you so much. We have other two hands. I believe the first one belongs to Kirat Pirince Karavit. I don't know how to pronounce the name. I believe.
Yeah, it's correct. Thank you. Yeah, correct. Okay, thank you. Thank you for this talk. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the text, with the subject, but what were the other faiths in the society during the translation or the production of the text? For example, Central Asian immigrants like Sogdian faiths. Could it be the influence of the confrontation of other faiths? Because during this time there were a lot immigration from Central Asia, and they were the translators of in between China and Central Asia. So could it be the influence of the confrontation with other faiths and religions?
This is a wonderful question because it allows me to talk about my favorite topic, which is the translator of the Buddha Charita, Bao Yun. So he was a Chinese person that went to Gandhara, northern India, and he met a dhyana master, a meditation master from probably Kashmir, Buddha Bhadra. They went back to China together, and Buddha Bhadra was probably of Yogacara orientation. We had some meditation manuals taught by him in China. The environment is the beginning of the 5th century. They first stopped in Chang'an, and the actual major confrontation, major controversies was with another Buddhist teacher, Kumarajiva. They didn't get along well with Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was of Central Asian origin. He didn't have a clear Buddhist tradition behind him, like while Buddha Bhadra had. He could sport that he had. He was a disciple of Buddhasena, Dharmatrata, blah blah blah. So it was a lineage behind him. So the two didn't get along.
Kumarajiva in Kucha.
Kumarajiva was from Kucha, but was like prisoner in China for 13 years. That's an interesting way to learn Chinese. And then he was moved to Chang'an, and he was during the reign of Yao Xin, of the former or later Qin dynasty, but it was at the beginning of the 5th century. I think the beginning of the 5th century. I don't remember the correct date, but they met at around the first decade. Before the first decade of the 5th century, they met in Chang'an, and they didn't get along well. So they moved to the south, where the Buddhist tradition was already thriving, and they were hosted by the founder of the Liu Song dynasty. So they were in the Jiangkan, modern Nanjing. They were translated there. And I think that, thinking about it, the most probable opponent was, I mean, outside of the Buddhist tradition, was probably the popular early Taoist tradition. There's no clear reference of encountering some other culture. Like it's too early for the Nestorian influences in this stage, I think. Not so too early, because they arrived in the north slightly afterwards, but I think they were moving mostly in a Buddhist or Taoist environment in southern China.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Desi.
Yes, Desi Vendola. I thought she was at Columbia, but I think she finished her PhD.
Yes,
yes. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
I think very well, must be quite close to your topic, Laura, about Buddha life. I know this from Alessandro Poletto, so I mean.
Oh.
So unfortunately, I know much about you. But Desi, please go ahead.
Yes, and I also know Laura, so nice to see you, Laura. So I just wanted to add to something that was mentioned earlier about the early apologetics. Laura, have you looked into Moses Li Huolun?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you should, because basically this is a lot of questions are raised, from imaginary, opponents, and it's a very interesting text about the early reception of Buddhism. I'm not sure, I haven't compared with the life of the Buddha, but there are very important questions, like if you leave the family, what are the implications, who's going to make the offerings to the spirits, and all of that. So it's early Han, very important text. It's usually translated as the disposing of errors.
Yes, thank you. This is exactly the kind of conversation I imagine to have. So thank you. Desi, you remember the day where we were met in Ghent? Those were the days we didn't know that afterwards the world would change so much. Anyway,
Yes.
thank you so much. Of course, I will look into it. And do you think in this text there also a specific reference to cosmogony, to the origin of the universe?
I'm not sure because I read it many years ago while I was studying in Peking University, so it's more than 15 years ago. But it's a very important text just because it addresses early reception of Buddhism from the Chinese perspective, like Taoist and Confucian perspective. And it's one of the earliest ones, if not the earliest. And I think it's very useful just to keep, in our minds about early questions that Buddhism raised to the Chinese.
Of course, the question of abandoning the family is probably the...
Yeah, and it's, of course, there is a little bit of the element what the Buddha himself did. So that's the element of the Buddha's biography. How to explain that, yes, he abandoned his wife and child, but then he preached the Dharma to them after he reached enlightenment. So he gave them a much better gift than just, living with them. So there is this argument that I remember. But
yeah, and it also explains why in later biographies of the Buddha, most composed in China, they also had some sort of framework, like by trying to explain what happened in previous lives. And what happened in previous lives actually justify why the Buddha had to leave his family and his child and his wife, etc., etc. So this was a major problem.
It's a tension, right? Because it's breaking with the norms. Also, like the Visandhara Jataka, where, of course, he's giving away everything. And it causes a lot of tension, and they try to explain it. They usually explain it that, of course, the final goal, the enlightenment, is worth everything. So yeah, I think you should take a look at it's a small text. It's not very. And if you need a reference, just maybe email me, and
I will. Thank you, Desi. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you. I'm very glad I can join the event.
Are you in New York?
I'm actually right now back home because it doesn't matter where you are right now, and I prefer to come back. But I'll soon be relocating to Berkeley because I have a postdoc in the Graduate Theological Union.
I was like worrying about the time frame.
No, it's good for me. It's good for me. It's midday.
Okay.
Okay, nice to see you.
Thank you.
So I don't see any other hand. Federico, do you see any other hand? No? Lisa?
No.
So I think we can thank again Laura, all the people who intervened and participated to this talk. And since this is a joint venture with Federico and Lisa, I leave to Lisa to announce next conversation.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Thank you, Laura, for the beautiful talk. And we had a very nice conversation afterwards. I'm happy to see that so many people joined, and we hope to see you on the 21st of April to welcome Ger Sigurdsson, whom I thought was also among the audience, who will give a talk, Anonymous Leaders and Easy Victories, Taoist Traces in Sun Tzu's Heart of Warfare. The time is the same, 11:30 Central European Time. We are very much looking forward to welcoming you again to our talks, and thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.